The U.S. Agency for International Development has been in a state of turmoil since the president ended federal funding on foreign aid 1 month ago today. We're talking about the practical and political implications of that order, and here to discuss it, we're joined by Dr. Nevena Trajkov, Political Science Department Chair at Jacksonville University. Good morning.
Good morning.
Kelly McBride, an international development consultant and mediator who managed USAID humanitarian programs and worked in 7 countries in Latin America. She lives here on the First Coast. Good morning, Kelly.
Thank you, Ann.
And we're joined on the line by Susan Reichle, former Senior Foreign Service Officer at USAID. Good morning, Susan. I think that was my bad, Susan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ann. It's great to be here.
So, Susan, can you begin just by describing the work of USAID, why it exists, and what it does?
Sure. So USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, was created by President Kennedy. Actually, the origins of it go back to the Marshall Plan, because when we looked at the wreckage of World War II, it was understood by the global leaders that to prevent war, we needed to invest in economic assistance. And then President Kennedy, with authorization from Congress, created USAID. And it has been now global for the last 63 years, providing humanitarian assistance. But most importantly, it really is part of our national security apparatus. We have defense, we have diplomacy, and we have development. And so it's really shocking that we would take away one of the really key tools in our toolbox to preventing violence and really to keeping Americans safer.
And we know that the president halted grants and loans on a national level the first day he took office. That order was later rescinded, but this foreign aid order has remained in place. Susan, can you just sort of explain what that impacts?
Yeah, well, it impacts about $40 billion of assistance that was appropriated by Congress. I want to be clear that Congress appropriated these funds. These are programs across the globe, from, as I mentioned, humanitarian assistance to health programs. The United States has done an amazing job of preventing HIV spread, has literally saved 25 million lives. I could go on and on about economic assistance, the work we're doing with migrants to prevent them from coming to the U.S. southern border. For example, Colombia supports 3 million Venezuelan migrants with assistance from the United States. As you mentioned, Anne, on the domestic side, there was an immediate court order and a temporary restraining order, and those programs on the domestic side were able to continue. On the foreign assistance side, no. Even though the judge has issued a temporary restraining order, frankly, the State Department under Secretary Rubio and Pete Morocco have trampled it, and essentially are really not obeying the law. And so I think we're going to see even more litigation as the weeks come forward.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that. But Kelly, first of all, since this USAID shutdown, you have been in touch with people who are working for the agency currently, some of whom are stationed abroad. Can you kind of describe what their circumstance is?
Well, for the people who are stationed abroad, they feel totally abandoned by their government that they've worked for many years, taking American values abroad and helping vulnerable people and bolstering our national security. So they feel abandoned by the government. There are people who are in very difficult situations in Africa, in the middle of conflict zones, on the front lines, and they don't have access to their emails from USAID, so they can't communicate with anybody. They don't know how they're going to get back home. Who and how are they going to get themselves, their household goods, their family back to the United States? So they're very upset. And people who do this work, they have a big heart for other people, for helping people. And they, as I did, are proud to take American values abroad. That's what motivates people, helping people, taking the best of us abroad. And so there's people overseas who are in quite a difficult situation. they don't have homes to come back to probably because they either rented them out or they just didn't have one because they've been overseas for quite a while. So they're in a very difficult situation. Everybody's helping each other, trying to find housing. People are offering their homes, their couches, helping people find jobs. The last time I worked for USAID was in 2017 in Colombia, where Susan worked, and but I'm still very much in touch with my this ecosystem.
Yeah. And I know we've heard some really harrowing stories about certain attempts by USAID workers to pull back, particularly in Congo, which is a
Hmm.
active war zone. We heard about families that were forced to evacuate during advisory level 4s, which is, basically an embassy advice that nobody travel because of the danger. We've heard about people having to leave behind everything that they owned, their children's favorite toys. One family had to leave behind their dog because
Hmm.
they weren't able to have any assistance in evacuating safely.
No, it's devastating to people on a personal level, and frankly, I'm appalled at this shutting down, dismantling of USAID, because we're leaving people overseas in the lurch, people who've depended upon the United States, people who we've built goodwill with over decades. People are going to die overseas for sure. They're not getting food aid, they're not getting crucial medicines. Um, a big piece of AID is working on global health and also on, as you know, predicting famines. So that work will not be done
I want to
anymore.
ask you about that because, there has been this order to reinstate food aid that the administration has walked back certain elements of these freezes, these firings um, at the federal level. And so there was some assurance that the food aid would not be part of this restriction. But I guess that's not the entire picture. Can you kind of explain what other things go along with providing food aid that complicate just the food component?
Um, Well, you have to get it from the farmers in the United States, right? The food aid is coming from American farmers. Um, Rice, soybean, peanuts from Georgia, right from our neighbors. Um, so you have to get it from farm to market. So that's on these ships that are sitting, uh, maybe in U.S. ports. Yes, it's in Houston. They're sitting in U.S. ports, but they can't be delivered, right? Because there's no one to receive them on the other side. There's no USAID staff or contractors to receive them on the other side. So, along with food and medicines, they're just sitting in a U.S. port. So, it's the farm sector in the United States is very going to be very badly impacted by this.
Yeah.
There's some 20 some odd states that are involved in selling food to USAID.
I want to
Including
invite
Florida.
people to join our conversation if they would like to. We are talking about cuts to USAID. You can reach out on email. That's First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. You can call us at 904-549-2937. And we do have a message on Facebook that I want to get to in just a minute because there's questions about, how money is being spent and also a lot of rumors about how money is being spent. But first, I want to talk to you um, about what this means in terms of our own national interest, Dr. Trajkov. How does this impact either U.S., just kind of our relations abroad, U.S. security?
Well, I appreciate the answer that people who work for USAID are doing it because they believe in American values and they want to do good in the world. But we cannot underestimate the influence that USAID has had on our foreign policy and our presence in the world. We go into these countries that are developing, that struggle, that are impoverished to help them out, but we also use it as a method of soft power to promote our values, to promote the United States, and to foster trust and build trust between people in different countries and the United States to make friends. That soft power that we are the ones, we are the country that we want them to look to. And with the shutting down of these programs and pretty much the abatement of the United States from, Western liberal democracy, what we do is we open up a space for others to come in, and those others are probably going to be from Moscow or Beijing. And it really does harm then our stance and our ability to promote our values, Western liberal democratic values in the world, and allows for more presence of messages and value systems that run contrary to our interests.
And we do know there's been some reporting, for instance, that a group that was funded by USAID that did some, pro-democratic work in China has already been approached by a agency of the government of China offering to provide that funding instead, which presumably would somewhat change its goals.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very rational move by China, right? It really is like when you see the ebbing and the scaling back of um, I don't want to say adversary, but a country that and a government system that challenges your own, right? The Chinese communist regime, and you see that they are scaling back. You jump in on that opportunity, and it really is doing a disservice for us, and while doing a favor for our adversaries, particularly Russia and China.
So what I do want to get to this question of spending because the press secretary for the White House recently listed all of these things that USAID was allegedly spending money on that were particularly controversial allegations that they were spending $32,000 in on a transgender comic book in Peru or DEI business, a play in Ireland. I know that the reporting that was done subsequent to that found that that money was not actually being spent by USAID, but by the State Department, which is, a separate funding. But there have been questions about, waste, fraud, abuse. What can you tell this particular questioner about this money and whether it's being accounted for appropriately?
Well, I can tell you that USAID has been monitored in a very meticulous fashion by the U.S. Congress, by the Office of Budget and Management, by the Inspector General that the Trump administration fired for USAID. Um, Senator Rubio, Secretary of State Rubio, was one of the strongest champions of USAID. He spoke out very eloquently, repeatedly, about the good work of USAID and how vital it was for national security. He asked for more assistance for USAID.
Yeah, he actually asked for additional funding.
He asked for additional funding, yes, before he became Secretary of State. So when you work in a mission overseas, I worked in Colombia, we had repeated congressional delegations come down and visit the programs and talk to all the local counterparts, the local people. So almost every single project from USAID, it has a line item that's been approved by Congress. So 4 committees in Congress look at USAID programs, no? The 2 ones that work on foreign affairs and the 2 ones that work on appropriations. So I don't doubt that there's room for innovation and reform. And every time a new president comes in, of course, they look at all the U.S. programs and make them to their liking. That's appropriate. The way it was done was inappropriate.
I want to take some calls here if we can. Chris in St. Augustine. Good morning, Chris. Go ahead.
Good morning. I find it quite interesting and maybe a little bit tone deaf with all the struggling that Americans are going through, having Hurricane Helene in Western North Carolina go through, basically forgotten about, left abandoned, grocery prices skyrocketing, inflation over the past 4 years, and try to scare us with China after telling us that we couldn't criticize China and pretend that it was, a virus, a bioweapon that got unleashed on us by our own government funding bioweapons and turning them against us. You guys really are hilarious that you're going to think that American people want to support other countries when we're $36 trillion in debt. It's time for the adults to take charge and stop the spending and start spending it on Americans and making our lives better for our children instead of spending transgender comic books overseas and the line items, the trillions of dollars of waste that our government, who we just kicked out and elected someone who's going to do something about it. I thank God for Elon Musk and all the work he's doing. And y'all need to wake up and start supporting this reform because Americans don't want this waste any longer. We're tired of it. We're sick of it.
Thanks, Chris. I want to take a call from Sally in Springfield. Good morning, Sally. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. My comment is that if anyone thinks the new president and his billionaire unelected partner Elon Musk cares about us, they are gravely mistaken. Americans here and abroad are thrown into chaos in a constitutional crisis, and it's not just my thinking on that. Heather Cox Richardson, American historian, believes that we are in a constitutional crisis. I feel that many of us reject what's going on, the destruction of our values and our institutions, and it has brought trauma and discord to real Americans who, as you're talking about today, are stuck overseas. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. I also want to take a call from Don in North Jacksonville. Don, go ahead, please.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to share that I work for two companies in my experience. As I said in past calls, I worked in media. I worked for Univision years ago in Texas. And when I work for these two companies, when there's downsizing and cuts, they usually send a team to review and look where it needs to be cut, check performance of employees, and that takes time. And I remember when I worked for Univision in Houston, Texas, they came in and they did a review, and it took them, and when they came back, it took them about maybe 3 months or 4 months. And this is a review they were doing around the country. And when they cut USAID, and not only them, but all the agencies around the government, and they're doing it in just like 1 week or 2 weeks, it's to me, it's obvious that they're not doing a reviewing or analyzing of who it needs to be let go because they're not needed with too many employees or their poor performances, or it seems to be as clear cut. Now, I listened to a legal podcast yesterday, and they said the wording of DOJ says that they're not allowed to do any actions. They're only allowed to advise. The only person that is allowed to take actions in DOJ is the president himself, according to the wording from this legal podcast.
Don, I'm going to just put you on hold if I can, because I do have a bunch of calls to get to, and I kind of want to keep it rolling. Ed, just briefly from NAS Jax. Go ahead, Ed.
Yes. Well, it is a fact that the agency, the USA, has done some good work, and is doing some good work. Even Secretary of State Rubio said that publicly. But it's also a fact that cannot be thrown by the side that it has done some completely wasteful programs around the world, and that they have not had the transparency up to now for us to know what they're doing, good or bad. That has been the big difference. Also, regarding Russia and China, listen, Russia and China, when they provide any aid, if any government turns against them, against what Russia and China wants to do or vote for in the United Nations, they will have consequences. And that's why they don't do it.
Hey, Ed, I want to ask you a question if I can. Ed, you cite lack of transparency. And why do you feel that there has been a lack of transparency? Do you have a specific instance of that you'd like to ask about?
Sure, because up to now, nobody have made it known where some of this money into things like $20 million for Sesame Street. Do you think if they would have publicized that, people would not have a problem with it? Or $1 million for Swedish scientists to study a German butterfly? I don't know why Sweden and Germany need our foreign aid, but, all that kind of ridiculous stuff.
Okay.
That's what's been the issue.
Thanks, Ed. I want to toss it to Kelly and see if you can address some of those issues that we've been asked.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to the transparency issue. Until a month ago, you could go onto the USAID homepage and see every single program that had ever been implemented on the USAID homepage. Full transparency. Right now, they have everything down, so you can't go onto the USAID homepage and find out anything about the programs that were. They have everything archived. There's a period where you can get to like 2021. I was looking at it this morning, but there was full transparency by USAID, more information, more data, more resources than you can imagine. All of that is gone, along with the institutional memory and the expertise. I also wanted to talk to the gentleman who talked about spending. 2/3 of every dollar that USAID spends is spent hiring Americans and buying American goods and services. And in the agricultural sector, it's absolutely huge. It is $340 million from the agricultural sector is paused right now. In 2020, it was 2.1 billion in food aid, all bought from American farmers. So a lot of USAID money is spent, in fact, in the United States with universities in Florida. There's 23 farms that are involved. There's aid with 4 different universities. It's about $10 million a year. So there's a ecosystem of universities, 45 universities, a lot of Christian-based organizations that do humanitarian aid, private sector groups, NGOs that are American groups that collaborate with USAID and receive money to do that. It's a lot of jobs across the country.
Dr. Trajkov.
Yeah, I want to respond to, or at least acknowledge some of the things that the callers have said. They came in, a couple of them were very passionate about their positions. And some might just dismiss them as extreme viewpoints or out of touch viewpoints, or our viewpoints were out of touch. But I want to highlight the thread that has been presented by all the callers. Americans are going through a hard time, uh, struggling to pay their bills, the cost of living, buying a home. And one caller pointed out wasteful spending. Another caller pointed out the hurricane relief happening in North Carolina, right, and all these other things. This is, I mean, obviously in very different tones. This is indicative of that the American people are struggling, and they're viewing the budgets for USAID as wasteful. But the dichotomy is what we're labeling as wasteful is not what is being done in Washington by Doge, Elon Musk, and the president. They're doing absolute total cuts. This is not trimming. This is not, as one caller put it, the one who was working at Univision, an evaluation to find out, where to cut the fat. This is a pure, axe to the knees of USAID. I mean, total cuts in all spending. So there is, I hope people can appreciate the tension of, we are struggling in the United States. We're being asked to tighten our belts so that we can pay our bills, find homes, pay for homes. We can't buy a home, right? The cost of living is high. Why should we be spending money for these programs? And yes, there may be room for reform, for evaluation, but that evaluation needs to be done diligently. But while we're asking about waste, they're doing total cuts. And I
Right.
hope people can see that tension.
Susan, I want to ask you about that too. I mean, just the ability to close the loop on some existing programs. I mean, one I thought rather troubling story that was reported on this week was about women in South Africa who have participated in a clinical trial that is aimed at preventing unwanted pregnancies and the spread of HIV infection. They've been they've installed inside their bodies this ring, and there was not an opportunity for those devices to be removed based on the timeline of the closure and the cessation of funding. And I think there's a lot of people that think that that trust in that community in participating in a clinical trial like this has probably been ruptured irreparably. But there really hasn't been an opportunity, I think, for some agencies to complete at least the work that they have outstanding.
That's correct. And I think that's a great example of what is happening multiple times across the globe right now is the broken trust between the United States and countries we partner with. And it is incredibly dangerous. Just to address some of what was said in the calls just now, yes, people are struggling here at home. But that does not mean that it's wholesale cutting like these types of programs, which are not only going to break the trust, but are also going to jeopardize lives, makes us better off. It is very dangerous what's happening now. We monitor in more than 90 countries disease reporting. And early detection in Ebola, when I was still with USAID, prevented Ebola from coming to the United States. We don't have that now. So if some of your callers are saying, yes, keep cutting, just cut it all to the ground, we don't need nuclear scientists, we don't need disease reporting on bird flu, Ebola, Marburg. It will come here. The whole point of foreign assistance is to help make Americans safer. And I'm very concerned, as everybody has been stating, on this panel, that there's not a deeper understanding of what the United States Agency for International Development does. And it's up to us, and that's why I wanted to join you today to share in local markets, because I think there's so much misinformation. 11 of the 12 things that were put out by the White House were completely debunked as being attributed to USAID. So there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and I hope we can correct that, because we're going to lose a vital tool for our own national security and safety. And I think, unfortunately, some of the callers in your area may be affected.
Susan, I want to ask you, I mean, you mentioned Ebola. We know that there actually is a current Ebola outbreak in East Africa, and so that's not a concern these days. But specific to the issue of migration and how USAID efforts play into migratory patterns, can you just sort of address that? Because obviously immigration has been a huge issue for this country, and certainly in this last election.
Absolutely, and as it should be. The American people are concerned about the surge in the southern border, and so what USAID has done in not just Colombia but also Brazil, in Ecuador, was to work with local partners to provide support. That's everything from food to shelter to medical care, working with the countries, working with the partners to prevent the migration to our southern border. As I mentioned, 3 million Venezuelan migrants are in Colombia and supported by USAID with the Colombian government, who has assumed a lot of those responsibilities. Right now, we have an explosion of violence in Catatumbo, Colombia, which is on the border with Venezuela. And unfortunately, we can't get those really critical services there to the people in Catatumbo, 50,000 people who then can start to suddenly migrate to the southern border. So it just doesn't make sense, because we have to be doing more in these communities in order to prevent them from coming, obviously, to the United States.
I'm going to take a call from Lisa in St. Augustine. Good morning, Lisa. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on. I've worked for some of those international NGOs that received USAID funding on both food aid and HIV prevention programs. And I just want listeners to know that the process for getting money is very, very well. There's a lot of oversight. Maintaining that money and getting your quarterly payments requires a lot of reporting, financial and otherwise. So this idea that there's rampant fraud and crazy spending is just, it's inaccurate. And I would say to the gentleman about the comic books for trans communities, programs that are preventing HIV/AIDS for marginalized people who are usually undereducated or not educated, you've got to meet them at their level. So a comic book with behavior change information about how to prevent HIV/AIDS is appropriate. It's not wasteful, crazy spending. You're providing useful information to somebody who needs it. And these people are usually working in the sex industry in some ways in spreading AIDS. So these are important programs. They seem silly, but they actually have a purpose. And it's been well thought out by people in this industry. These are important programs. And having been downsized during COVID and living in East Africa, I really feel for the USAID staff who don't have phone numbers and emails and anybody to call for support. Because I was in an adversarial relationship with the organization. It felt adversarial. I'm not surprised a third of us was laid off because of financial issues. But it was very uncomfortable to be just ripped out of where you've been living for 7 years and told to go home. I had phone numbers. I had somebody helping me get an airline ticket and helping me with the things that I owned and the car that I had to sell and getting out of my apartment lease. I just feel for these people. It's horrible.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. I'm going to take a call briefly. Taylor at the Beaches. Go ahead, Taylor.
Hey, good morning. I've called in numerous times about an issue right here locally and turns out that I've heard that on the dashboard that the man mentioned, that the AFL-CIO, which locally in cahoots with the mayors of the beaches, our lower Mayor Donald Deegan, who all claim fairness for all, are in cahoots with these unions to pad these politicians and management's fat, cushy pensions while taking them from people who started at the bottom.
Taylor, I appreciate your call. I think that's a little bit off topic. I want to take a call from Ben in downtown. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, hey, so first I want to just say hi to Dr. Nevena Trajkov. She's a great professor, and it's great to hear her on WJCT. My comment is that I think that a lot of Americans and a lot of the callers that we're hearing from are misled about how much foreign aid we're giving away and where these foreign investments are really going to. I think that they don't realize that these foreign investments actually do benefit Americans indirectly. If you look at our investment in Ukraine, there's this misconception that we're spending way more than the European Union. In reality, when you look at aid versus GDP, we're actually trailing the European Union. And also, even investments in Ukraine's military, which it might be hard to see how this could help us, we're getting key insights into Russia's military capabilities, North Korea's military capabilities, and our military is actually becoming stronger and more technologically advanced thanks to the aid that we're giving to Ukraine.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. We are going to have to kind of wrap it up here, but I do want to ask you, Kelly, I know that there is an effort to sort of spark assistance for some of the people that are working overseas, but also, I don't know, generate philanthropic money to replace some of the money that has been halted. Can you talk a little bit about just, I don't know, if people are interested in becoming involved in either of those efforts?
Well, I would ask them to do something else, which is to call our senators and our representatives, because this is not only about USAID, this is about the demolition of the federal government across the board by President Trump and the world's richest man. Without much thought, without really a profound look at the different programs, it's going to hit everyone sooner or later. So I would ask people to call their members of Congress and their senators. That's the first thing. And of course, Americans are very, very generous and very altruistic. We do a lot of things in our local communities. So maybe we can help in that way, but also if you have a favorite charity, like I'm just going to give one example. For example, Samaritan's Purse, which people know is based in North Carolina. It's done a lot of work with the people who were hit by the storm. They're also a big USAID partner. So they have no money to do their humanitarian work overseas. So if that's a charity that you like, you could donate to them. Catholic Relief Service is another one. FIU has had a huge program with USAID in the administration of justice and working with democratic institutions, electoral tribunals, legislatures. So I think you could look at local charities to help out who might be working with internationals, and then look at the charities that work, humanitarian groups that work internationally.
Yeah. And in terms of contacting local lawmakers, Susan, I mean, one of our local lawmakers here, Aaron Bean, is actually a co-chair of the DOGE effort, and so an enthusiastic supporter of that. Any thoughts about that? And again, just very briefly.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, as I'm talking to members of Congress, staffers, and others, they don't know what's going on. So I really urge people, like Kelly said, to call their members of Congress and say, did you know? And just being able to share, because they think assistance is flowing right now, because the court ordered it last week to flow, and it's not. So please call your congressman, call your congresswoman, and let them know really what's happening and to look into it.
All right. Well, Dr. Nevena Trajkov, Kelly McBride, Susan Reichle, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.